There is a leather-bound book in the archives at Downieville, California, that lists mining claims filed in Sierra County in 1852. The book records who owned what. It records boundaries in feet and inches. It records transfers between partners, sales, and abandonments. It records the names of the men who signed as witnesses and the dates the district recorder inked each entry. What the book does not record is how much gold came out of any of those claims. Not 1 ounce, not $1, not one line. That's not an accident. That's how every mining district in early California was designed to work. The district recorder tracked ownership. Production was somebody else's problem. And if you were the man doing the digging and you wanted to keep your gold, you made sure production stayed exactly that, somebody else's problem. So the real books were kept privately, in tents, in cabin footlockers, in pouches carried on the person, ledgers most of the time, letters some of the time, notches on a piece of wood the rest of the time. There was the public record, kept by the district, and there was the private record, kept by the men who dug. 2 ledgers, 1 camp. Only the first one survived on official paper. The second ledger is the one that tells you what actually happened at these camps, and you can only find it by walking backward from what you see on the ground, through what the surveyors mapped, and into the private papers that a handful of families kept. By the end of this, you'll know 3 things. You'll know why Sierra County, California, formally incorporated on April 16, 1852, at the peak of the California gold rush, chose to organize itself around a claim recording system that on purpose ignored what came out of the ground. You'll know why a single sluice claim at Downieville, 60 feet square, paid out $80,000 in 6 months without either the state or the federal government ever recording it as production. And you'll know why the reconstruction of what these camps actually paid out came, decades later, from the intersection of 3 sources: the county recorder's ownership book, the private ledgers that survived in trunks and estate sales, and the field notes of surveyors who walked the ground and measured what the water had moved. That's the second ledger. It isn't one book. It's a reconstruction, and it exists only because a few surveyors, working through the paper trail long after the miners were gone, refused to accept that the first ledger was the whole story. To understand what happened here, you have to start with the ground itself. Sierra County sits in the northern Sierra Nevada, on the eastern edge of what people at the time called the Mother Lode, in country so steep the trail from the ridge down to Downieville dropped 2,800 feet in 4 miles. To the east of town, the Sierra Buttes climb to over 8,500 feet. To the west, the North Fork of the Yuba River runs down toward the Central Valley through a canyon that in places narrows to almost nothing. At the point where the Downy River meets the North Fork, the 2 streams come together in a bowl of gravel and boulders. That confluence is called the Forks. In September 1849, a Scotsman named William Downey led an expedition of 9 miners into that bowl. 7 of his men were African American. One of them was Michael DeVerney, an Irishman. They struck rich gold that first fall and built a log cabin to wait out the winter. By 1850, the camp at the Forks had 15 hotels, 4 bakeries, 4 butcher shops, and a long list of saloons. In the same year, John Craycroft and Company put up a log building with a bar 70 feet long, ripped from a single sawn board. The camp was renamed Downieville after Major Downey. For the next 2 years, the population climbed almost straight up. By 1854, more than 6,000 people lived at Downieville. To put that in context, the entire city of Los Angeles at the same moment had about 4,000 people. In the same year, Downieville lost a vote to become the state capital of California by exactly 10 ballots. Sacramento won because of accessibility. Downieville was buried in snow half the year. The gold was there. A housewife swept out her kitchen one morning in 1852 and found $500 worth of dust and small nuggets in the dirt of the floor. Along the North Yuba, at a shallow gravel bar just outside town, 3 men worked a spot they called tin cup diggings, every day for weeks, according to accounts that later reached print. Those 3 men filled a pint-sized tin cup with gold before quitting, not a coffee cup, not a mug, a full pint measure. Then they quit for the day. Half a mile up the North Fork, in the summer of 1852, a claim of 60 feet by 60 feet paid its owners $80,000 in 6 months. In modern money, adjusting for 173 years of inflation, that single claim paid out something on the order of $3 million in half a year. From a patch of gravel the size of a small suburban lot. Those are the numbers that stick. They stick because a few of them were written down, and what makes them remarkable is not the amounts. Every book on the gold rush has amounts like these. What makes them remarkable is that almost none of them appear in any official state or federal ledger from 1852. The state of California, in its first years, had almost no way to measure what came out of a mining district. It could count people, roughly, and it did. It could count buildings, roughly, and it did. It could not count gold, because the gold left the camp in whatever form and by whatever means the men who dug it chose. Some of it went out as dust in leather pouches carried on horseback down the trail toward Marysville. Some of it went out as small nuggets sewn into the linings of coats. Some of it went by mule train to Sacramento, and some by wagon after the road was cut. A portion, and no one has ever been able to say how large a portion, never left the camp at all. It sat in cabins and safes and holes dug under floorboards, waiting either for the owner to come out at the end of a season or for the owner to die and someone else to find it. If you were the state or the federal treasury and you wanted to know how much gold came out of Sierra County in 1852, you could not know. Not from the recorder's book, not from tax records, not from shipment records. The number was distributed, uncounted, across thousands of men who had every reason not to let anyone else count it. This is where the recording system matters. When a new area of the Sierra opened up for mining, the men who arrived would call a meeting. That meeting was called organizing the district. It was a formal thing, held on the ground, sometimes in a saloon, and sometimes just on a flat rock beside a creek. The men voted on the boundaries of the district. They voted on the maximum size of a claim, which varied from area to area based on how the ground was working, and they voted on a district recorder. The recorder's job was straightforward and narrow. He kept a book. When a miner located a claim, meaning he marked its corners with rock piles or wooden stakes, he came to the recorder, gave a description of the ground, paid a small fee, and had the claim written into the book. If the miner sold the claim later, the recorder wrote in the transfer. If the miner walked away and abandoned it, the recorder eventually noted the abandonment. At Downieville, the district rule was 30 feet per man. That was the maximum length of a claim measured along the direction of the creek or gulch. A single man could hold 30 feet. 2 partners could hold 60, 3 partners could hold 90. The rule kept small operators in play and prevented any one outfit from grabbing a whole stretch of paying gravel. The recorder tracked all of that. He tracked who held what and where the corners were. He tracked when the ground changed hands. He tracked the disputes when 2 men claimed the same bank. He did not track what came out of the ground. There was no line in the book for production. There was no place to write down that a claim paid $10 a day, or $50, or $1,000. There was no requirement and no mechanism to report gold, and because a miner had every incentive to keep his production private, the recorder did not ask. Even if the recorder had asked, no honest answer would have come back, because reporting your gold was the fastest way to lose it. The foreign miners tax was passed by the California legislature in 1850. It required any miner who was not a United States citizen to pay a license fee of $20 a month. In modern purchasing power, that fee was somewhere between $500 and $600 a month. For a Chilean, a Mexican, a Chinese, or an Irish miner working a claim, it was often more than the claim itself paid in a bad month. The tax was designed and enforced to drive foreign miners off the paying ground. It worked. By 1852, roughly 15,000 Mexican miners had been pushed out of California entirely. Many returned to Sonora. Others went south to the places of Baja California. The Chinese population held on, but only because Chinese miners took the least attractive ground, worked in tight groups, and moved money through channels that white American miners could not see into. If you were a foreign miner in Sierra County in 1852 and you reported real production, the tax collector took a piece of it. If the sheriff was corrupt, which he sometimes was, he took another piece. If a claim jumper heard you were paying well, he might come try to take the whole thing. So you did not report real production, ever, not to anyone, not on paper. The underreporting was not a scandal, it was the operating system. For American miners it worked slightly differently. There was no monthly tax on them, but there was the same pressure from claim jumpers, and there was the pressure of partnerships. If you and 2 other men held a claim together, and one of you took gold out in the evenings that the others did not see, the other 2 would suspect it. Fights broke out over exactly this question, and men were killed. So partners kept private notebooks of what they took out, and they kept them privately, not because the state cared, because the partners cared. The result was a 2-book system at every district from the beginning. Book 1 was the district recorder's book. It said who owned what. It said where the corners were. It was public, it was signed by witnesses, it was accepted in court, and eventually, when the county was organized, it fed into the county recorder's official archive. Book 2 was the private ledger. It said what came out. It was kept by the individual miner, or by a small partnership, or occasionally by a company. It was private, it was hidden, and in most cases it did not survive. You have to sit with what that means. For a whole year, 1852, the peak year of California gold production, when the state was mining something on the order of $81 million in gold, the actual production numbers from Sierra County were not being written into any accessible ledger. They were being scattered across thousands of private notebooks that were themselves being lost in fires, in floods, in accidents, and in the ordinary quiet way that paper disappears when nobody thinks it will matter. On February 19, 1852, a fire broke out in Downieville. The town at that point was still mostly tents and cabins. The fire ran through the ramshackle structures in an evening and did about $150,000 of damage. Whole blocks were reduced to ash. Men lost the cabins they had built, the tools they had bought, the food they had stored for winter. They also lost their private ledgers. Nobody wrote about the ledger losses in the press. The press wrote about the buildings. But when historians many years later tried to find production records for the winter of 1851 into 1852 at Downieville, the trail went cold precisely at the fire. The private books had burned along with the cabins. The town rebuilt fast. J.M.B. Meroux, who was one of the earliest merchants at Downieville, put up a stone building that summer with big iron doors and shutters, built with Chinese labor. That building still stands. It is now the Downieville Museum. Meroux built in stone because he had just watched the town burn once. He did not want to watch it burn again. Other men, quietly, learnt the same lesson about paper. They started keeping their private production books in tins. Some buried the tins. Some left them with family in the east. Some sent them by mail on the first stage back to the coast for safekeeping. Those tins are, in some cases, the second ledger. When one of them showed up in an attic in Massachusetts in 1889, or in an estate sale in San Francisco in 1902, or in a box handed down through 3 generations of a Downieville family, and finally opened by a local historian in the 1930s, the numbers inside were the first honest look at what the camp had actually produced. They were also, in most cases, incomplete. A single miner's ledger tells you what a single miner took out. It does not tell you what his partners took out separately. It does not tell you what the men on the next claim over took out. It does not tell you what the Chinese company working the tailings pulled from the reworked gravel after the American partnership above had walked away. To get a real number, you needed hundreds of these ledgers, and you needed to line them up against the district recorder's book, so you knew which piece of ground each private ledger was talking about, and you needed to line them up against the geography, so you knew what those pieces of ground had actually looked like when they were being worked. That third piece is the surveyors. Sierra County was formed by an act of the California legislature on April 16, 1852. It was carved out of Yuba County, which had grown so unmanageably large that the state simply cut its northeastern half off and gave it a new government. Downieville was named county seat. In June of 1852, the residents of the new county elected Ferdinand J. McCann as their first county judge. In July, McCann organized the Court of Sessions, which handled criminal cases and county administration. The first session of the actual county court was held on March 7, 1853, more than 9 months after the county was created. Almost all of the county's early administrative infrastructure had to be built from scratch. There was no courthouse, there were no county officers of most kinds, there was no county surveyor. The federal government, meanwhile, had its own problem. California had become a state in September 1850, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo required the United States to honor Mexican and Spanish land grants issued before American acquisition. In 1851, Congress passed the California Land Act, which required every private land title in the new state to be reviewed and confirmed. That review needed surveyors, hundreds of them. working from often incomplete paper trails to establish, on the ground, where the corners of Mexican-era land grants actually ran. The General Land Office, which was the federal agency responsible for public land in the United States, began sending surveyors into California starting in the early 1850s. Their initial work was the private land grant confirmation. But once a surveyor was in the field, especially in a county as remote as Sierra, he was often the only person in the region with the training to measure ground accurately. County commissioners started hiring these men, sometimes formally and sometimes just as consultants, to help sort out disputes. Miners started paying them to survey claims. Partnerships started paying them to survey the boundaries of the ground they were splitting up. And when disputes reached court, the surveyor's field notes became evidence. Those field notes matter for the second ledger because they measure ground. If a district recorder's book says a claim is 60 feet by 60 feet at Tin Cup Diggings, and the surveyor's field notes say the actual worked ground at that location is closer to 80 feet by 90 feet, you know that either the recorder made a mistake, or the miners had expanded quietly beyond their filed boundaries, or the surveyor had walked into a spot the recorder never accurately mapped. Multiply that by dozens of claims, and you can start to reconstruct which pieces of ground were being worked more aggressively than the paper said, and which pieces were being underworked. Combine that with the private ledgers you can find, and you can start to build a picture of what came out. You can also see the discrepancies inside the recorder's book itself. Because the district recorder was a busy man, and because Downieville was full of men who could not read or write, entries were sometimes made in the presence of witnesses who did not understand what was being written. When a claim was later contested, the discrepancy would surface in court. Court records at Downieville from the years 1853, 1854, and 1855, when the county judge and later the district judge began hearing mining disputes, are full of these arguments. Two men would appear with two different versions of what the district recorder had originally written down. Historians reading those court transcripts learned to treat them as accidental production records. A dispute over a claim was almost always, at bottom, a dispute about how much gold was coming out. The men were not fighting over the paper for the paper's sake. They were fighting because the ground was paying. So the actual reconstruction of what Sierra County produced in 1852 and in the years just after took the following form. First, the district recorder's book, which gave you ownership and boundaries. Second, whatever private ledgers had survived, which gave you spot production for specific miners. Third, the surveyor's field notes, which gave you ground truth about what pieces were actually being worked. Fourth, the county court transcripts, which gave you disputes that hinted at what was coming out. And fifth, the shipment records at the assay offices in Marysville and Sacramento, which gave you at least a lower bound on how much gold was reaching the coast from Sierra County, even after the miners had done their best to keep it invisible. Layered together, those five sources let historians estimate that the Downieville area alone, in the years from 1849 to 1855, produced somewhere between $15 and $25 million in gold. Some estimates go higher. The bottom of that range is more than 3 times what the state's official production figures for the same area suggested at the time. To put a scale on the gap, consider the LaPorte district, 20 miles to the west of Downieville, which historians have documented more thoroughly. LaPorte produced more than $60 million in placer gold between 1855 and 1871. That's the official figure, reconstructed from state mineralogist reports. But when the private records for the LaPorte partnerships have been checked against the state totals, the discrepancy suggests real production was closer to 80 or 90 million. That kind of gap, applied to the whole northern Sierra in the years 1850 through 1855, means the state of California was probably counting something like 60 or 70% of what actually came out of the ground. The rest slipped through the cracks, into pouches and tins and letters home, and into the small private ledgers that miners kept for themselves and never showed to a state official. That is what the second ledger reveals. Not a scandal, not a conspiracy, a system that was working exactly as designed. The design just did not include a place for the actual number. You can walk the North Yuba drainage today and see the physical evidence. At Tin Cup Diggings, at the confluence in the middle of Downieville, you can still see the reworked gravel bars from 1849 through the mid-1850s. The stones have been turned, the bars have been dug into again, and dug into a third time. In some places, the diggers built stone ring walls to divert water while they worked below the level of the river. those ring walls are still there. Half a mile up the North Fork, at the location of the 60-foot square claim that paid $80,000 in 6 months, the ground shows the same pattern: turned gravel, small stone dams, occasional lengths of wooden sluice trough, split and rotting, half buried under moss and pine needles. The trough was the actual working tool. Gravel was shoveled in at the top, water was run through, and gold was caught in wooden riffles at the bottom. Every sluice you see on the ground is a small piece of a production number that never made it into the official record. Farther up the drainage, at Goodyear's Bar, at Poker Flat, at Poverty Hill, at Port Wine, at Scales, at Eureka, at Brandy City, at Camptonville, at Gibsonville, and at LaPorte, the same evidence exists. Worked gravel, stone rings, fragmentary sluices. The North Yuba drainage as a whole shows 15 distinct mining districts of the early gold rush era. Every one of them ran the same two-book system. Every one of them left the same kind of physical footprint. Every one of them underreported. The county archive at Downieville still holds the district recorder's books from those years. If you go to the Sierra County Clerk Recorder's office in the same courthouse building where Judge McCann's Court of Sessions first sat in 1852, you can pull the volumes down and see the entries in 19th century hand. Some of them are faded almost to nothing. Some of them are still crisp. They still list only ownership. The second ledger, in the sense the historians use the term, is not one physical book. It is the reconstruction. It is the work of 170 years of research done by families who kept old ledgers, by county historians who tracked down private papers, by federal surveyors whose field notes ended up in the National Archives, and by mining engineers who eventually walked the ground with better instruments than any surveyor had in 1852. If a single surveyor found it, that surveyor is not one man. It is every man and every woman who has ever tried to reconcile what the official record said with what the ground and the private papers showed. There's a human layer here you have to reckon with. The miners who kept private ledgers were not villains hiding their taxes. They were mostly ordinary men, in a country with almost no functioning tax collection outside the coastal cities, in a boom moment that would not last, trying to hold on to what they had dug out with their hands before somebody, whether the state, a claim jumper, or a corrupt sheriff, took it away. They knew the boom was temporary. Every one of them had watched a placer bar peter out. Every one of them had heard about a camp that was rich one summer and empty by the following spring. They kept the private book because they understood that if they did not keep the private book, they would end up with nothing to show for the work. Some of them ended up with nothing anyway. That's the part of the record that always gets left out. For every Downieville miner who walked out of the North Yuba drainage with a small fortune, 10 walked out with nothing. Some died on the ground. Some drank their gold in the saloons on Main Street. Some sent it home to families in Cornwall, or Chile, or Canton, and never saw it again. Some had it stolen from their cabins. Some lost it in the February 1852 fire. And a small number, quietly, buried it, meaning to come back for it later, and then died before they did. There is still gold in the ground around Downieville. Not the kind of gold the placer bars gave up in 1852, but small pieces of the second ledger, in the form of the pouches and tins that men buried and never recovered, are almost certainly still in the hillsides. Every so often somebody finds one. A pouch, a rusted tin box, a leather bag with a few ounces of dust still inside. Those finds do not go into any state record. They go into the finder's pocket, and then, sometimes, into a private conversation with a local historian, and then, more rarely, into a museum. But the pattern is the same. The gold from Sierra County in 1852 keeps coming out, in small pieces, 173 years later, and it keeps going into the same category it always went into: private, unofficial, uncounted. Which brings you back to the book you started with. The leather-bound volume in the Sierra County Archive lists claims filed in 1852. It does not list production. That was never its job. The job of the district recorder was to keep the peace between claim holders and to give the county something to point to when a dispute reached court. To know what came out of those claims, you have to open the second ledger. And the second ledger, as we have said, is not one book. It is dozens of private ledgers held by families in Massachusetts and in San Francisco and in London and in Sydney, sitting in trunks in attics, waiting to be opened. It is field notes from federal surveyors filed in the National Archives in Washington, waiting to be pulled. It is court transcripts from Judge McCann's early sessions at Downieville, waiting to be read for what they hint at rather than what they say. It is stone rings on the North Yuba and rotting sluice troughs half buried in moss, waiting to be measured. It is assay office shipment records at Marysville, sitting in the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, waiting to be tallied against what left the mountains. All of that, together, is the second ledger. Follow the paper trail home. That's what this story really means. The trail does not go to a lost civilization. It does not go to a suppressed government archive. It goes exactly where the record actually is, which is scattered. It goes to Sierra County, formally organized on April 16, 1852. It goes to Downieville at the confluence of the North Yuba and the Downey, 6,000 people strong by 1854, 10 votes short of being the state capital. It goes to Tin Cup diggings at the Forks, where 3 men filled a pint cup with gold every day and did not tell anyone the number. It goes to a 60-foot square patch of gravel that paid $80,000 in 6 months and appeared in the recorder's book as 60 feet by 60 feet and nothing more. It goes to a February evening in 1852 when a fire burned the private ledgers along with the cabins, and the town rebuilt with stone doors and iron shutters, because at least the buildings, this time, would not go up in smoke. It goes to the Meroux stone building on Main Street, which is still standing, which now houses the County Museum, which holds, inside it, a handful of the private ledgers that did survive, names in ink, weights in ounces, dates in a hand that has been dead for 150 years. It goes to every surveyor who has walked the ground since, federal, state, county and private, measuring what the river moved, measuring what the claims produced, reading the discrepancies, reconciling the 2 books. Nobody kept the real numbers in one place, the way a modern government would keep them. The real numbers were structural. They were built into the system. The first ledger was ownership. The second ledger was gold. The 2 were separated on purpose, because the men doing the digging wanted it that way, and because the state of California in 1852 had no way to make it otherwise. Only later, when historians and surveyors and archivists went back through the paper, did the second ledger emerge as a real object, and it emerged not as one book, but as a shape, a reconstruction, a pattern of numbers that no single archive holds and no single document contains. The sluice troughs are still in the gravel. The stone rings are still in the North Yuba. The Meroux building is still on Main Street. The claim book is still in the archive. The second ledger is still being written. You just have to know it was ever there to look for.